Well, thank you very much. And yes, thank you for being here on a Friday night and on a sunny Friday night when you could see our cats roaming in the countryside. So particular extra thanks to that and people who are doing the same at home. Although who knows, if there's someone out there with the connectivity of the signal, they could be roaming and listening at the same time, which would kind of be perfect multitasking. So it's lovely to be back with the Festival of Debate. For those who don't know me, I'm Natalie Bennett. If this was a really formal occasion, which it definitely isn't, that would be Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle. But Natalie, please, please, please. And I'm here. This event has been put on by Sheffield Green Party. We've got 4 great speakers who are going to bring different perspectives to the question of just access to land. And I'm feeling particularly excited because I could claim this was all carefully planned. That would not be true. This is incredibly joined up because yesterday I'd urge you to go home and search for House of Commons Hansard yesterday's date, because Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, had an entire debate that she originated on access to land yesterday. And at almost the same time, I was in the House of Lords speaking about amendments to the Levelling Up Bill, including a review of access to nature and trying to make the government review its maps on where we do have access, moorland, upland, etc., because they're now planning to not review the maps for 25 years. And I put down amendments to tackle all of that. And it's particularly lovely to be here because, as you can imagine, in the House of Lords, when I talk about right to roam, when I talk about, as I like to do, the saying particularly loudly and leaning forward towards the hereditary Tories and hereditary crossbenchers opposite, what we need is land reform. I get some negative reactions. And I kind of have a feeling reading this room that that's not what we're going to be here tonight. I think there's a lot of people here who understand that we desperately need access to nature. Now, we've got 4 great speakers, so and we're starting a little bit late, so I'm not going to talk very long, but I do just want to put in a couple of reflections. One being, and this is something Caroline said yesterday in the House of Commons, the reaction I got in the House of Lords was, oh, but people will drop litter and they'll disturb rare wild animals and they'll make a mess, and what state will our countryside be in then? That was the reaction I got. Which my answer is, we don't have right to roam. What state is our countryside in now? I'm sure many people in this room know that we have one of the most nature-deprived corners of this planet. The State of Nature report for a few years ago ranked us right down the bottom of the global scale. And something very relevant here, and that I do a lot of work on, is some of the most magnificent creatures who should be flying in our skies. That is the raptors, like the hen harriers, like the eagles, are being shot, trapped, poisoned out of our skies. And one of the things that would happen under right to roam is there would be more eyes in the countryside who would make it more difficult. Often the police are challenged about their failure to prosecute wildlife crime. Yes, it's difficult, but if there's more witnesses, it becomes easier. And the other thing is, yesterday morning, I was actually at a interesting group, rural policy group, in this very expensive city law firm building. You wouldn't believe the lifts. The technology of the lift is amazing. And these are people who advise, big farm businesses. And so they invite me along for a bit of radical seasoning for their debates. But they were talking about the Internet of Things, and there was some waxing lyrical about how they plant
because of course this is also very much about human health and well-being. So we've got 4 great speakers, each of whom is going to speak for 10 minutes. Yes, I'm going to start coughing loudly otherwise. And then because we've got a great audience here and at home, and we want to allow plenty of time for discussion as well. But so what I'm going to do now is hand over, having done a bit of a roundup for a warm-up for Right to Roam, to Nadia Sheikh, who's an ornithologist and naturalist who works for the Right to Roam campaign, and is also, and I have to give a particular note of praise here, a trustee of Wildlife and Countryside Link, which writes the absolute best briefings for wildlife issues in the House of Lords. So I really appreciate those. So over to you, Nadia.
Thank you. I don't feel comfortable with the microphone. Thank you so much for setting up so much of what I'm about to say, actually. And just as you were talking, actually, you were talking about being like a radical seasoning. And one of the reasons why I left the nature conservation sector, which I did to work for Right to Roam, was like this kind of nexus of what happened during COVID and with Black Lives Matter was a moment when I realized actually my heart sits within land justice and wider land issues other than more than just wildlife. And that was this kind of really problematic conversation around we need more diverse people to access nature, but at the same time, all the conversations were happening. Oh my God, loads of people are coming out into nature. This is really bad. And I was like, this makes no sense. And so increasingly over my career, I recognized that we were talking about people accessing nature as a really important way of helping biodiversity thrive. People need to see it, to love it, to care for it, and then to do something about it. But then none of that was actually happening in policy or action. And so I increasingly got aggy and more aggy, and then moved over to work for the Right to Roam campaign. And I guess that's what I'm here to talk about. But first, I just want to say a massive thank you to the Green Party for bringing that debate to Parliament yesterday. It was a really momentous and important occasion to have different avenues it was coming from. But generally, like all parties were like, yeah, we need more access to nature. And whether that's like the full kind of Scotland model, which is what we are supporting, or just more generally recognizing that young people do not know nature and do not get out in it, and the value that is kind of for our young people. So I'll just generally talk about the Right to Roam campaign, who we are and what we do. I feel like you guys maybe probably know, but that's what I'm here for anyway. So the Right to Roam campaign very much like sits on the shoulders of giants that have been doing land justice work over like decades and decades. And I guess this is just the newest iteration of calling for a right to roam and increased access to the countryside. Started about 2.5 years ago. And over that time, we've just been trying to get the conversation of what is a right to roam back into the public conversation and like back into kind of our awareness. I think we've done that through kind of trespassing quite a lot over the last couple of years. So last year was our year of trespass. So we did heaps of trespasses on estates across England, in order for us to be able to have a conversation around the fact that we've only got access to 8% of land, and that is crowland, and to help people reimagine again, like, well, that doesn't feel like a lot. And I guess last year or the year before, when I started campaigning with the Right to Roam, most of the conversations I had with people were like, well, that doesn't feel like a lot. Is it only 8%? Really? It doesn't feel like that for me. And so like fast forward to now, we are now legitimately and realistically now not just being like radical trespassers, but actually there's a genuine conversation of maybe we should have more access to our green spaces, and that 8% needs to extend wider. And so for the first couple of years, we kind of talked about we need an increase in the land that we can access. But given the amount of public support and just it feels like the time is right for us now to be talking about more of a Scottish model. So this year marks 20 years since the Scottish Land Reform Act. And so, I don't know, maybe a raise of hands. Who here goes to Scotland or has been to Scotland and loves Scotland? Yeah, it's amazing, right? You can kind of just be in it in its full wildness. And maybe some nods of like, does it feel a bit different to England? A little bit. Yeah, I live there now. So like, it's very weird coming back down to England. I'm like, I can't go anywhere. It feels like viscerally different as I walk around the countryside. And so we've been having heaps of conversations with those in Scotland that helped get the Land Reform Act around what was their process and what was their thinking and what was happening culturally on the ground in Scotland. And generally, yeah, I guess the arguments were many, but there was one that stuck in my head that I think is worth saying, which is that this idea of like having set places that people can go and can't go exacerbates this idea that there are different siloed places where maybe people are, where farming is, where we live, where we work, but actually maybe we exist in a more meaningful kind of way with our landscape. And I guess that's at the heart of the Right to Roam campaign. It's not about getting out walking. It's not just about recreation. It's about being. It's about our rightful belonging within nature. And it's about rooting ourselves amongst the hills and the woodlands and the rivers, and being able to do more than just walk. The countryside is kind of synonymous with recreation, kind of lycra, kind of hiking boots, walking, OS maps, which is a really beautiful thing to do. But that's just kind of one way of enjoying nature, and one way, and it's not the way that we can potentially save it. It's not the only way that we can kind of save the countryside and help biodiversity, which we were speaking to. We can be the eyes and ears, and we can feel like we belong. And when we feel like we belong, we feel like we have agency to protect it. And I've been talking a lot with my friend who's writing a book, and a lot of the kind of the core of that book is around like this idea of eco-anxiety and this helplessness that we've got. And I think there's a couple of things I think that make eco-anxiety a thing, and that's we don't deal with grief very well as a culture. We don't deal with grief at all, but we are grieving, like the loss of our hen harriers and our white-tailed eagles, our curlew, our ringoozle, all of these beautiful kind of upland species. We are grieving it, and maybe we're not acknowledging that it is deep grief. But when you pair grief with a complete lack of agency to do anything about it, I think it's just this stuckness that we all feel. I feel that as a naturalist and ornithologist, having the right to roam is like a really important foundation and cornerstone to the work that we can do to then go and think about what does equity look like when it comes to housing, when it comes to growing food, when it comes to existing in the landscape. Right to roam is absolutely foundational because it's about a cultural sense of belonging in a place, and then at some point then having agency to do something about it. I did not plan this talk at all, so I can't remember where I was going with it. So I guess maybe that just paints a picture of what the Right to Roam campaign is about. It's been a struggle, and like you say, the biggest kind of the most time that we spend is talking about litter and dogs and ground nesting birds, when actually, why aren't we having a conversation? But then in the same breath, people are like, oh, people don't know about nature anymore. It's terrible. And so then I'm like, so is the answer then to in perpetuity separate people from it and never teach them again? But then in reality, the reason why our birds are declining, why our ecosystems aren't doing so well and our rivers are functionally dead is not because of people existing in the countryside. And I always think about, I worked in the environmental conservation sector for over 14 years. And managed over 15,000 volunteers, and every single person I've come across who loves nature loves it and is doing something actively about it and is dedicating their life to it because they know it and they love it and they've spent time in it. I don't have evidence or that much evidence of people that spend time in nature and then are like, I don't swear, I don't care about it, it's a bit crap. And so I guess that's why we do what we do, because we believe that people need to have that sense of belonging again, and we'll only get it if in our hearts we know that it's our right. And so I guess the campaign is where it is. Yesterday was a brilliant discussion in Parliament. This year, our strategy and our work that we're working towards, we'll do like some trespassers. We've got some good trespassers planned this year, but it's really to make sure that with this kind of groundswell of support for the right to roam, obviously not from everybody, but there is a groundswell. It's not watered down just to like adding a few more % to existing crowland, but actually it is a full, robust right to roam. And we will get it. And when we get there, then we can start doing that work of reconnecting and re-healing again, so that perhaps we don't litter. I actually don't think that many people do litter. I just think rubbish is blown around everywhere. Of course, people litter. I did litter one. I remember one time dropping litter and an old woman following me like for 10 minutes to the train station and like giving me it back, and the shame. But look, I'm now, working for Right to Roam. People can be reformed litterers. So yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's concentrated in one space. Yeah, exactly. It's helpful. And so it extends way beyond that. I don't want to go past too much time because there's keeps of people that need to speak and we're running late. So I'll probably just leave it there. And then if there's any questions later on, we can.
Thank you, Nadia. And that was absolutely brilliantly structured, just like you'd planned it all out perfectly and for 10 minutes. So well done. And I think that feeds us beautifully into our next talk. You can see the, I'm assuming the people at home can see this as well, meeting our 30 by 30 targets, Dr. Steve Carver from the School of Geography at the University of Leeds. And I have to just preface this by noting, and I'm sure that Steve will be saying more about this, but also in our debate in the House of Lords yesterday, we were focusing on the fact that national parks and the areas of outstanding natural beauty are no better for wildlife than the rest of the countryside. And many people don't realize that for international classifications, they actually hate to create a separate, different classification for British national parks because they were so bad and they were not what any other country would have called a national park, because in other countries, national parks are there for wildlife, to protect the natural world, and ours were not set up that way. So I'm sure Steve's going to say a lot more about that, so I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Exactly. It just took my main headline point there. Okay, yeah, so I'm Steve Carver from University of Leeds, School of Geography. There's some other badges down there. One in the middle there's the Wildland Research Institute. I'm director of that. It's a kind of a loose collection of people with interests in the wilder end of the landscape spectrum. And the other one at the end there is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And Natalie just did allude to that in the context of our national parks and not really national parks in the context of IUCN definitions. And CEM is the Commission on Ecosystem Management. And I'm co-chair of the IUCN's Rewilding Thematic Group, or yeah. So you may have been aware that over Christmas, or just before Christmas, we had the COP15, and out of COP15 came some agreements on this 30 by 30 target. And indeed, the first three targets, you can't read them there because they're a bit fuzzy, but they are about participatory spatial decision making. That's going to become clear in a minute. As to how we might achieve that. I know it sounds rather technical, but targets 2 and 3 are about protecting 30% of the terrestrial, water and marine landscapes or seascapes, either for nature or restoring them where they've been degraded. And my big question there, and I've read this document several times now, nowhere in that document does it say, how the hell are we supposed to do that? It doesn't say, are these global targets? Are they regional targets? Are they national targets? How do we actually map that out? And it really is all about geography. So there's the first big question is where? Great targets, I think they're totally unrealistic, but nonetheless, they're setting out those targets. I mean, it says by 2030. That's 7 years less. Second big question is how we do that. And the third big question is, well, who? And I guess that's where we come in. And I'm a geographer, so I like drawing maps. So I started thinking about these targets at a global scale. So if we take, and there's a nice product out there called the human footprint, and it maps all of the human impacts on the planet, from nighttime lights to roads and cities and agricultural land use, all of those things, and puts them together into a map. And it's kind of what I do, but at a much more local scale. And if we say, well, okay, top 30%, where is the top 30% least impacted landscapes in the world? And here they are mapped out. And the grey areas are the IUCN category 1 and 2 areas. So those are strict nature reserves, wilderness areas, and proper national parks, not our national parks, which are category 5. And so there they are all mapped out. But then you think, well, in terms of targeting ecosystems, what we really want to do is protect 30% of the different ecosystems on the planet. And so these are the yellow areas as well mapped out on there. Because if we zoom in and look at Europe, we say, well, okay, we can slice Europe up in a similar fashion. Could we do it at a European scale? Look at those top 30% at a global scale, and it starts to get awfully complicated. And of course, as you move into a continent like Europe, a lot of those top 30% are actually human landscapes. You know, they're farmed or they're grazed or you know, other forms of human land use. And so it starts to become a really tricky problem. And of course, what I've tempted to do is, because I'm here in Sheffield now, is say, well, okay, there's the UK. And of course, Natalie, you were talking about Scotland, and Scotland is different. You know, Scotland has much smaller population than we have, a much smaller economy, and all of these wild areas. And I spent a lot of my career actually mapping wildness for the Scottish government. And it's our work that sits behind the wildland areas in Scotland. And so you can see that pattern in Scotland, but you know, there's not much going on south of the border in terms of those top 30%. However, if you start slicing things up and looking more locally, you start to see the pattern. So here we are in Sheffield, and of course we've got the Eastern Moors over there, but we've then got these little patterns of green in there, which might be part of this regional pattern of the top 30%. So in terms of Sheffield, you might sort of say, well, okay, what's in that top 30%? Mostly moorland and woodland. What's out? Well, some of the parkland, you can see the green spots on the satellite imagery, they could perhaps be better incorporated into that. And of course, all the intervening farmland and obviously the urban areas. There are some opportunities here about how we might improve connectivity of Sheffield as a city and the population of Sheffield to some of these green areas. And of course, we see the valleys, the Rivlin Valley, etc., running down into the centre there. So there's opportunities for improving connectivity for people and for nature. And I think that's the critical thing here. We're talking about access to land, but access to the land for who or for what? Yes, for people to appreciate nature and therefore value it, but also access to the land for nature. And that's where the rewilding bit comes in, you know, because if we think about rewilding, it's a process by which we're allowing nature to call the shots, but determine its own ecological trajectories. But it's us as humans having the maturity and the humility, if you like, to give it space and time to allow it to do that. And of course, this is a difficult question in terms of the geography as to how we do that, how we connect those spaces up to allow species to migrate in the face of climate change, etc., in a coordinated fashion. And so, yeah, we've got some riparian corridors along the valleys. We might join up our parkland. Let's look at the farmland and think about regenerative farming, a la NEP in West Sussex. Restoration of the moorland areas away from grouse shooting and to a more natural mosaic of grassland and scrub and forest. And, you know, even with the farmlands, you know, looking at opportunities in terms of community farms. Last slide, but what we've been doing for Rewilding Britain is to look at using spatial models to map that connectivity. So if you look at the underlying resistance for species movement in a landscape based on land cover and based on human features, you know, towns, cities, roads, etc., which present barriers to species movement. The yellow areas on this map, if you like, are, think about this as a map, a circuit board with lines of high current. And so these are the lines of high current moving from positive to negative. And you can see them following those valley lines and following the woodland in those valleys from the upland areas down into the city. And so there's this is our EcoConnect project for Rewilding Britain, and it's UK-wide, and we're using this new model called Omniscape and this thing called circuit theory. And what we're doing is to aid their planning as a decision support tool to think about how to maximize that ecological connectivity when highlighting areas for rewilding sites. So I'll shut up there, but I think the key thing is we've got to move from this ethos where we have ourselves at the top of some biotic pyramid, this what's it called, egocentric model of humans and nature, and bringing ourselves into a more circular model where we might label that ecocentric. And you know, this is what my point about making space for nature and giving nature access to land is just as important as making space and giving ourselves access to that land. Anyway, I'll shut up there.
Thank you very much. And I think there's an enormous amount to unpack in that talk, and I'm sure we'll come to a lot of that in the discussion. And I think that point about connectivity, I was just sitting thinking about something else I have lots of arguments about in the House of Lords with people who come up and say, well, we've got to kill badgers because they're killing hedgehogs. And hedgehogs and badgers have lived together in Britain successfully since the last ice age. And I actually had Hugh Warwick, who's known as Mr. Hedgehog. He's done some of his BBC programs on hedgehogs are utterly amazing. And he came to Green Party conference and said, what's killing hedgehogs is the lack of connectivity. They actually roam remarkably widely. And again, one of my other very small amendments to the Levelling Up Bill is building new housing estates. Whole other issue, but just leave a little gap in the front fence so the hedgehogs can get through. And that kind of very basic level of thinking about nature, even when you're building this possibly quite dreadful for humans housing estate, at least think about the hedgehogs. Okay, we've kind of sort of gone into thinking about being in the natural world, and our next speaker I think is the perfect person to follow on from that. Bob Berzin's he wrote and I helped put together a report on the uplands around Sheffield quite a few years ago now. I have a feeling hen harriers might just pop into this next talk somewhere along the way as well. I can't actually remember, I can't see my notes of what the title of the talk is, but land use to benefit everyone. There you are, that's the title. Over to you, Bob. No, just hold it somewhere in your vicinity.
And the next slide, I just.
Oh, do you want me to say next
yeah,
slide?
okay.
Say next slide.
Okay. Yeah, well, lovely to see everybody here. So I'm Bob Berzins, an activist and campaigner, and I campaign mainly about the grouse moors, and it's about the moorlands that I'll be talking about this afternoon. So we're living in a biodiversity crisis, a climate crisis, and a food crisis. And the common factor in all these is the way that we use and manage our land. And I feel I have no real say in how any of that happens locally. So the Just Access to Land campaign aims to give people a voice and to make real changes here in Sheffield. So next slide. Yeah. Okay. So here we have a fairly, feels like an unsophisticated land use map compared to the ones that Steve was showing us, but that's a land use map of Sheffield. So we have Sheffield is bounded on the east by the M1 motorway and on the west by the Peter Street National Park. The red bits are urban areas, the brown bits are moorland, and you'll notice that the moorlands are very close to the urban areas. So what happens up there really does affect us all. So the pattern of land ownership around here was determined by the Enclosure Acts in the 1700s, and in 1779 we had the Manor of Ecclesall Enclosure Act, which gave 1,000 acres of wasteland or moorland west of where we're standing here pretty much, out along West Street, if you know the local area. And that land went predominantly to the Lord of the Manor, who was Earl Fitzwilliam. Prior to that, there'd been commoners' rights over the land. Fitzwilliam family still owned Bradfield Moors. Other aristocratic landowners have included the Norfolk, Duke of Devonshire and the Duke of Rutland, and his family now own the Mosca estate. So not only did they get this land for free, but we continue to pay them for it through agricultural grants. The 4 grouse moors within Sheffield get £650,000 a year of public money. Next slide. So the moorland is used for shooting grouse, and the aim of grouse moor management is to get 100 times the natural density, and that's done through manipulation of the habitat and manipulation of wildlife. Slide. So it's a typical moorland scene. What we have is very dry moors, dominated by heather, and that's because that's the main diet for grouse. And the thing that I would say with this kind of scene here is, where is the biodiversity? And we are living in a biodiversity crisis. Next slide. So the natural environment is something much more diverse. It's much wetter and more varied, with lots of sphagnum moss. That's the red stuff. And conditions like this are necessary to form the peat which characterizes this landscape. So no new peat is being formed on those dry heather moorlands. And for that reason alone, I would say that they are unsustainable. So how did we get from those wet conditions to the heather-dominated moors? Well, the answer is mainly through this management tool called rotational burning. A patch of heather is left to grow for 10 years, it's burnt, that's repeated, and that's gone on pretty much since the end of those enclosure acts in the 1820s or 1830s. So changing the habitat so there's lots of grouse. This is, the slide I showed you is the ideal conditions for breeding lots of grouse. So this photo shows 10 fires burning simultaneously, a huge amount of health damaging smoke drifting down into those urban areas. And as we saw from that land use map there, just a few miles away. Next one. So this shows you the aftermath of a burn. Heavy rain will pour off this patch of land that's been burnt, increasing flood risk. This is the opposite of natural flood management, which uses nature to slow down the flow of water from our uplands. So water that runs off these burnt areas contains a lot of peat. This is our drinking water, and a lot of chemicals are needed to remove the peat, and that's expensive. So burning dries out the peat. This is a typical scene if you walk over an area which has been burnt. So the peat cracks as it dries, the carbon in the peat oxidizes and CO2 is released. Wet moors sequester carbon, dry moors emit carbon. So what we've seen here is continuous interventions, management interventions, to create an artificial environment that benefits just a few people who shoot grouse. So wildlife is also manipulated. Any animal or bird that might harm grouse is killed, including this stoat. And again, this is a kind of a continual process. This killing goes on and on and on, because as soon as this stoat is killed, another one will explore that territory. And again, this is just a simple illustration that it's not a self-sustaining environment. It's one which requires huge interventions. So what we hear a lot about is a lot of very selective information and data, how killing all that vermin is necessary so we get lots more waders, including curlew, which is in the picture there. And doing it all to get yet more grouse is never mentioned. But this week, research showed that the biggest factor in declining bird populations in Europe is the intensification of farming. And right now, farmers are cutting silage where curlews are nesting, and drainage, pesticides and fertilizers have destroyed most of the suitable habitat for lowland nesting waders. So it's all about habitat destruction as far as I'm concerned. Okay. So if we take a look at the improved pasture between that sort of slice of moorland and the urban areas, this is the typical scene in Sheffield, taken from Fulwood Head Road, if you know that area. So there's some hedgerows, some trees, but mainly pasture improved by fertilizers and chemicals. And it's all been mown short by grazing animals. It's very poor for flood prevention. very poor for biodiversity. And I think we have to accept that globally we eat too much meat and dairy. That's all that this landscape produces. And even though we produce all that meat and dairy, we're still not able to feed everybody on the planet. So the answer for me is that we need more horticulture. We can have planters and polytunnels anywhere, including on the roof of a car park. And the recently sort of debated and enacted Environment Act makes it a statutory requirement that local authorities collect and compost food waste, and that will give us an awful lot of material for growing. Yeah, last slide. So I expect Fran will talk a lot about this kind of scene here. This is one of the market gardens in the Moss Valley. So in Sheffield, you know, typically, as almost any big city in the UK, we rely on large supermarkets to feed us, and they source their food from around the globe. We need a revolution in food growing, where much more of our food is grown locally, and we need to see a lot more examples like this. So to sum up then, our moorlands are globally important stores of carbon. They provide our water supply and could protect us from flooding. Instead, we continue to pay for them to be mismanaged, harming us all, and we can't let that go on. We can address biodiversity and food security locally, but to do that, we need just access to land. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. And I have to put another little advert in here, because what I was trying to do this morning, briefly with some struggles with the 4G signal in Sheffield, was Finlo Costain, who many people might know, did an alternative food summit. And this was because earlier this week, the government had a farm to fork summit at number 10. They invited the supermarkets in and the food manufacturers who would feed us all. That's the manufacturers, not the growers, the manufacturers. And so this was an attempt to look at an alternative way of doing that. That's also available to record, you might like to have a look at. But what you're going to hear right now is a lot more about the human health side of things, the way in which we cater to humans and use the land at the right to grow. So over to you, Fran.
Thanks very much. Can I have a little clicker, please? Which button am I pressing? Just this. Yeah. Right. Yes, a right to grow. Ooh, going wrong way. Yeah. The one that hasn't actually got an arrow printed on it. Yeah, handy that. Lovely. Yes, I should start by saying that I'm Fran Halsall of Regather. I have two positions at Regather, which makes my life slightly complicated. One of which is very long and quite new, which is a research associate with the Urban Agriculture Task Force, which is part of the South Yorkshire Sustainability Centre, which has just started this year. And I'm also Garden Services Manager, which is a little bit easier to explain. I design gardens and spaces, and I've started doing community projects, etc., etc. Landscape architect by training, so I'm very interested in how land is used. And I've ended up in urban farming because it's a way I actually address my climate anxiety, on something you're picking up on. It feels like an area I can actually make some difference in, I think, hopefully. That's the plan. Needless to say, it's very difficult to find any land to grow on. This is the major stumbling block. As they say, land isn't being made anymore. A lot of land, we don't know who owns it. It's expensive. Finding it to rent at a reasonable cost is also difficult. Unfortunately, through various decisions in the past, county farms were sold off, so there's no obvious place for people who want to go into farming to dip their toe in the water and do some training. We have lots of public land in the city, though. Sheffield's a very green city. A lot of that is amenity grassland of not particularly high ecological value. Some of it might be, some of it less so. There's a lot of underused allotments, an awful lot. There's a lot of overgrown allotments, but there's still demand for allotments. It's not evenly distributed. And of course, there's a lot of golf courses as well. And I often eye up golf courses and think, that's got a nice south-facing aspect. That'd make a great bit of growing area, but not yet. So yeah, this comes under the slogan of public land for public goods. Unfortunately, there are a host of statutory requirements on public land. Biodiversity net gain, net zero, and building green infrastructure.
housing, of course, and leisure and facilities. And that's not a complete list by any means. And we also don't have food production on the list. It's conspicuously absent. So the very thing that fuels the entire process of all these other things like housing and leisure and building infrastructure, the energy that goes into that, we don't get to have any food. It's not important enough, unfortunately. So for the last couple of years, working with Regather before I took on the research role, working on this paper that I co-wrote called Low Carbon in Food Infrastructure in Sheffield. And it looks at all the different elements of the food system. So it's not just a case of we need to grow food in soil. We could be talking about various technological approaches. We're certainly talking about glass houses, composting facilities, water retention, orchards, processing sites, the whole lot to make a resilient local food system, something that will actually help us in the face of geopolitical and climate shocks. Excuse me. We've also been involved closely with Sustain and Shared Assets, amongst other organisations, campaigning to make sure the edges of a city, so this is Sheffield, Bristol, Glasgow, London, Cardiff, I think that's the entire list, all coming together to argue for a better and more sustainable regenerative use of land around cities. That's my colleague Abigail in one of our polytunnels, looking very proud about the peas she's just picked, and they were delicious. We've asked for various things, and these are mainly asks of the council. Sometimes it's an ask of the city region, but we are in the process of developing a city and regional food strategy. That's just beginning to happen. We've been provided access with now what is known as the Rural Estates Management Plan, and as of this moment, we've actually got a meeting with the person who's making some of the decisions. So that's all very exciting. I didn't see that coming because we've been asking for that quite some time. I think it might be a big ask for the Sheffield City region, or the SIMCA as it's now known, to become an agroecological city region, but there's still time. We really, really importantly want an integrated training system. We need people with horticultural skills in this city to make it all work. We have a chicken and egg situation though, because what do you get first, the land or the people who know how to use that land? Because one is no good without the other. And yeah, looking at how food builds into the circular economy. So I'm just going to go very quickly through national policy. So there's nothing in law that, there's nothing statutory about the right to grow food. And of course, allotments do partly address the gap, but if you have a lack of time and knowledge and resources, then allotments aren't very much good to you. You need somebody else to grow your food for you. In 2022, there was a Right to Grow campaign that was led by Incredible Edible, amongst others. And it has had broad ranging support from MPs and Lords, but no movement on that yet, I don't think. But there is a proposal to change the law to recognise that public land that is suitable for community cultivation, and that could be by community groups or social enterprises, could be identified and made available to people. So it's a good commitment to have. Moving on. Interestingly, in Sheffield in 2021, we published a piece of a motion, the Right to Food motion, and this was primarily about recognising the crisis of food poverty in the city, which is extraordinarily high, and that also food poverty should not be seen as inevitable. And thanks to the Teal and Turpin amendment, it was passed with urban agriculture in mind. So this was specifically written in. You're going to have to forgive me because it's falling off the bottom of the screen here, but I'm sure I don't need to tell you people all the benefits of sustainable agriculture and what it can do for landscapes. But it's about thinking of it in the round, and there's a very good list, and I highly recommend having a look at what was included. Very recently, we've had a food policy published, Fairer, Healthier and Greener. So this is the food strategy for Sheffield, which I helped contribute to. And importantly, so nice bit of a name drop here, that's our project, Regather's project, East Street Sheffield. Very pleased to see that in there. The local council will work with communities and partners to identify spaces where food production and provision can be accommodated. So this is very exciting. This is a very important bit of policy that's been published. However, the food strategy is not very well aligned with the draft local plan. I spent 2 solid weeks of my life responding to the draft local plan, pointing out all the opportunities where the capacity to use land for food production in all its myriad ways was completely ignored. Unfortunately, it hasn't prioritised the ability of communities to take land to feed themselves, which means that neighbourhood plans won't really be able to build on that either. And that means, unfortunately, missing out on community infrastructure levy funding, which is a massive blow to any community group that would start a garden. So my proposals are that it is wise to continue pursuing the use of public land and seeing the ways in which it can be used for food production, because after all, it is a public good. I can't think of many other things apart from enhancing nature that matter more. But failing that, or in the meantime, I highly recommend that people come together and use their resources to set up community land trusts and buy private land and bring it into the public benefit, because otherwise we will always be on the outside looking in and asking for permission, whereas what we should be doing is saying that's our land and we're going to farm it in the right way for the benefit of people and nature. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Fran. And you've just reminded me of being in Huddersfield, where the parish council, led by Andrew Cooper, who some people might know, had the 1,000 fruit tree project, which did what it said on the tin. They planted 1,000 fruit trees in public land in that one parish. And the idea is that you're sitting watching the local team play cricket on an August afternoon, and you just reach up and pick a piece of fruit from the tree as you're sitting watching the cricket game. And I love that image. And why aren't all of our public spaces like that? And I have to say also, Your Right to Grow, I can feel an amendment to the Levelling Up Bill coming on. So we'll have a talk to you about that one. But anyway, that's enough talking from me. What we're going to do now is go to the Q&A. We've got about half an hour, and we are going to finish pretty well on time because I know there's also another event after this. We're going to do a very quick rearrange of the chairs. So perhaps I can ask all of my speakers to stand up, pick up their chairs and walk themselves round into a panel. We were going to take a break, but I think we might just go straight into Q&A, given we're quite short on time. So I'm going to start ideally whilst chairs are still being moved around me with, if there's anyone in the room who would like to ask a question, if you'd like to raise your hand. Yes, I think someone is probably going to deal with that in a second. Sorry, I'm just going to assume that all of this is happening in front of me. I'm ignoring what's happening in front of me. Is there anyone in the room who would like to ask a question of any of the speakers, ask them to expand on what they said? Or if you want to make a contribution or a comment, I will take those, but please do keep them short because we want to get as many people in as possible. So go on. Virtual gold star to the first person who's feeling brave in the room. Remember to wait for the microphone. Can I see any hands around there? Oh, okay. I can see a hand over there going that way.
I'm just curious. Does what we can do in urban areas, like does what I do in my backyard, actually make a difference? When we talk about rewilding, when we talk about nature, when we talk about biodiversity, it is what makes a difference actually these acres of moorland outside cities, or does what happens in cities actually matter?
Steve, I might throw that one to you first.
Yeah, regardless of what people say, size does matter. But when you add up all of those little bits together, then sure, yes, you can make a difference. And their connectivity is definitely the key. So yeah, your little things like cutting a hole at the bottom of your fence for the hedgehog, no mow may. I've been doing that for years. I'm lazy, so but all of those things can make a difference. An RSPB with a build it and they will come project and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, it actually does need big areas of land which is dedicated to nature. And Rewilding Britain have a target, 5% core rewilded areas, with 25% regenerative agriculture. Excuse me, I would say it needs to be more like 10% core rewilded areas. But anyway.
Thanks very much. Nadia, if you'd like to.
Yeah, just maybe on a more philosophical level, it absolutely matters that you as an individual can practice your agency to do something within your garden, and to experience a world alongside nature if you're lucky enough to have a garden, and to see the effect that has locally. Because if we don't care about and understand that the individual is important and what we can do is important, and we keep looking at like, what's the big structural thing I can do? I don't think we'll ever get there, because we often imagine futures and we imagine systems in the future rather than recognize that everybody alive today, right now, is important and needs access to food. And also just demonstrating that we can live alongside wildlife and it's fine, because like, you know what urban foxes and hedges and badgers are like, they're just snuffle along past you. So I think just as a practice for ourselves to do that work, yeah, it's really, really important.
Bob, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd just add that I think it's important to remember the physical health and mental health benefits of getting outside and doing something productive, something with a bit of physical exercise involved. And if you can do that, if you're lucky enough to have your own garden, fantastic, get out and work in that. And if you don't have your own garden, then yeah, I would hope that we would see an increase in community gardens, community facilities, community allotments where we can all benefit from that kind of activity.
And I will just add, throwing on from that public health point, Sheffield Rotherham Wildlife Trust, I'll put a little advert in for them, because they've been real national leaders in green prescribing, and in working to get people out into nature, you know, even in very local areas to their areas, and working to do that to improve people's health. And I know during the start of the pandemic, very innovatively, when they couldn't do anything else, they arranged for part of this scheme to just ring up people and have conversation with them about the wildlife they could see outside their window. And this was a way in which they were reaching lonely, bedbound people, could look out the window and have a conversation with someone about the birds and anything else they could see. And that was something that was very good for people's health. And I think, Fran, can I just throw this to you, perhaps a slightly varied question? What about growing food in small areas, small quantities, you know, a box on someone's balcony?
Anything that connects people with food, gives them the autonomy so that they feel that they can actually grow, is definitely a good thing. So you can be incredibly proud of a very small amount of food. And obviously, if you're going to pick it yourself, it's fresher, all those nutrients, you know, you can't have anything better. I grow a tawdry amount of food at home, but I do it because that's all I have time for. It's all I have space for, but it makes me feel like I've got a little bit of agency over what I'm doing. And I'm sure it does for other people as well.
I think that's a word that keeps coming up again and again, which is agency. Okay, we've got a question here in the second row. Yep.
Yes, when I was at school back in the 70s, boys had to study metalwork and woodwork, and the girls had to study needlework and cooking. But neither sex got to study how to grow food. I think things have moved on along quite a lot since then, but as far as I can see, still very, very few kids get the opportunity to learn how to grow. Is there a campaign to change that? Can we get that to national curriculum?
There's a lot of
Are there any good examples of what's happening in Sheffield?
Yes, there are great examples of what's happening in Sheffield. I would say that there's a lot of work nationally. The RHS have done a lot, good sustain, all the good food movements you can imagine have done a lot with children in schools. I've done schools gardening myself. It's not for want of trying, but you're right. I think it's there's something to be said for bringing it into the curriculum. The NFU have produced a very good guide to a syllabus on how to bring them into STEM subjects, so issues of ecology around food production, how like marketing and producing and marketing a product can actually be, you know, business planning and business skills, and it's really interesting the way that it can be integrated. But I would say that we're very much at the beginning of that process. And even if we start educating today's young horticulturalists and regenerative farmers now, it's going to take a little while to get them through the system. And so we've got to address the other side of it as well, which is who's leaving college and university now in order to, you know, make sure they can upskill.
Okay. Anyone else particularly want to come in on that one? Bob? Yeah.
Yeah. So I went to 2 or 3 workshops. A group of people doing a lot of work. I think probably went to more and more of these workshops than I did. It's about the Sheffield Food Plan, which is just I think final stage now, and that covers things like education, composting, what's happening, food banks, facilities, and the kind of input into making those work for people. So that there is a movement within Sheffield. I think when that draft plan is presented to Sheffield Council, because that's the aim, then, you know, I would hope that everybody, cross-party, all the councillors would look at it and take it on and, you know, really make a difference to what we do in Sheffield in terms of food production.
Brilliant. Question from the middle there.
Yes, another question really relating to education, but without wanting to be too much the devil's advocate for the landowning classes, of which I'm not a member, I hasten to point out, but they would tend to say things like, oh, well, we have 500 years of family tradition and caring for these estates, blah, 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 and we know how to do it. Now they're doing it, as we've heard, in a rather negative way, like the moorland, particularly with the grouse shooting business. But if you give people rights to roam, or generally you give them rights, they tend to take the rights and use them, and sometimes abuse them, and fail to recognize that they have responsibilities that are balanced with those rights, not to go into the sensitive areas, not to litter, and so on and so forth. So how can we actually develop that culture of care for our environment through education and through public communication and so on?
I'm going to go to Nadia first on that one, and then I'll come to you afterwards, Bob.
Yeah, thank you. I have a little anecdote to start with that one. I did a guided bird watching walk for the royal family 2 weeks ago. And had a long conversation about how it was really important for their children to learn the country ways. Not one person could name a robin, blackbird, or a wren singing, but when the pheasant called, that was the one that they could name. So no, I absolutely, yes. When you cut a population of people from regular passive and active access to nature for millennia, there is going to be one hell of a re-education process. And so we do need to resource that. And I think, so Scotland has only had like the Land Reform Act for 20 years, but there needs to be more, but there is resource and funding in terms of teaching young people about the Scottish Outdoor Access Code and how to be responsible. And that Scottish Outdoor Access Code is supported like across the board by landowners, by the NFU Scotland, by Scottish Ramblers, and by all different bodies in Scotland support this. Although it needs tweaking regularly, it needs looking at, and it's like, oh, actually that could be a bit better. This could be a bit more resource, but largely the Scottish Outdoor Access Code is a model that everyone's like, yeah, if people followed that, that would be great. So we need to invest in it. Of course, we need to invest in it. Just like I was saying at the top of this, you know, when I was younger, I littered. I also would drink cans of Stella in the park of an evening and probably leave them and fag ends. But I didn't know not to do that. And then I learned not to do that. And now I do what I do. So we have to believe, if everyone's sitting here thinks, well, I would never do that, we have to believe that everybody could also never do that.
I was tempted to go to Bob, but actually I think I'm going to go to Steve, because I think Bob's going to have a lot to say about our current landowners. Perhaps it's already said quite a bit of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there are good and bad examples in terms of the current landowners. But anyway, I think the ray of hope on the horizon, of course, is the GCSE in natural history, which Mary Colwell and others have been championing. And I think, you know, when your kids are able to tell you that don't do that, or we should really do this way, that's when people take note. And one anecdote is somebody, and I'll not mention the name, but we're really high up in the, you know, the sheep farming community and blah, 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 blah. Their tone has changed because their kids are growing up learning about rewilding and about you know, natural processes and things like that. And so this person is slowly coming on board with the rewilding movement, which is really, you know, a good example of how, you know, bottom up inspiration from, you know, kids learning about it at school. So I think, you know, probably Bob's going to say something more about that.
Well, or very short. I know we can fill the next half hour.
No, I'm not going to say any more about landowners, but I would say, well, go to Scotland, take a look at the situation there. I mean, I don't see a place which is trashed. You know, I see a place where people, by and large, they respect the environment. You know, they do a lot of wild camping out there. I don't see wild camping spots which are just a sort of total disaster zone. You know, so I think it can work. And the other thing, you know, is that certainly, you know, in terms of the Peak Park National Trust and other landowners, I know we got Danny in the audience here, but you know, we saw a huge influx in visitors after during and after the pandemic. because people couldn't come to, do anything in an environment with lots of other people around. So more people went out into the countryside. That did cause some problems, but the answer to that, and the answer that the Peak Park would come up with, and the National Trust and the rest of it, is that you just need bodies on the ground to educate folks. So it's Peak Park rangers, National Trust rangers, other people who work in those environments, and and I think it really can work. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Question from the other side of the room. Yep.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's maybe a little bit of a question for Natalie, and I think, for all of us in this room, we probably just feel heartbroken, right, that biodiversity and nature isn't more in the the forethought of politics and agriculture and farming. And I wonder, sitting in those rooms, what do you think is going on in their minds and spaces not to allow these things to happen, and what could be done differently? I think, or Costa Rica's done such an amazing job, and that was so long ago, but how is it that biodiversity is so just forgotten and abused even in today's policies and changes? It just feels like such a strange situation to be in, and so heartbreaking for all of us here.
Well, I think I'll start from the point of Steve's talk of the 30 by 30. That is an international obligation the UK has signed up to. And the government can and is regularly held to account and looks very uncomfortable. And, I face Zach Goldsmith all the time. I think Zach Goldsmith, more than once I have seen him as I'm coming down the corridor, Zach suddenly finds himself leaning fairly the other direction. But so the challenge is there, and the government has the rhetoric. I mean, I'm sure that every government minister has a yellow stick-it note on their computer that says, have you put world leading into every paragraph of your speech? And so we hear the government claiming all the time, we're world leading in tackling the climate emergency or climate change. They don't use the word emergency. We're world leading in protecting biodiversity. And that's so demonstrably untrue. But the fact is, we have made progress in that they've won the argument in that they have to say that stuff. And that is progress, because 10 years ago, they weren't even saying it. It wasn't even on the agenda. So what we've got is a staged process where we've forced them to acknowledge this is an issue. Now we've got to make them deliver. So we have actually made progress, and we're better than where we were 10 years ago. Now it's that getting from the point of rhetoric to the point of delivery. And there are some surprising people on our side. One of my regular allies is the Earl of Caithness, who is actually really quite solid and really quite decent. And there's also Lord Randall of Uxbridge, who's a birder and a Tory peer, and is absolutely a champion. So there are actually people on all sides of the house, and progress is being made. The Commons is harder, weirdly enough, but the starting point is, I think we come back to the education and the youth. If, particularly when you're talking about the Commons, if the MPs hear from all their constituents all of the time, they're concerned about biodiversity, then they will react, because the MPs have to worry about what their constituents say. All right, I'm going to try and get some more. You know what I might do is I might take 3 questions in a row and then put them together and take it. So we'll go here and then up to the back and then over here. Yeah.
One thing that puzzles me, and I don't know whether you have what the latest is that we're not collecting food waste and compost, particularly I think in Sheffield. And where I live, I'm not allowed to keep compost because of fear of rats, etc. So I have to throw it away, and it breaks my heart over all these years. And whether one there aren't schemes in Sheffield, but all over the country is a national scheme to collect food and compost. And I gather there was a thing in Clapham, so I think it's in Yorkshire, I don't know, that with anaerobic digestion, you can get rid of most bugs actually, and without any problem, and create further compost to use. So it seems to me a win-win thing, but we don't seem to do it here and in other places. I wondered what we can do.
I'm going to throw that one to Fran. We'll take the next question up the back next. Yep. So we're just going to try and get as many questions as we can. Oh, yep. Right. Yep. Go.
And just a comment about the urban and the rural, going right back to the first question, actually, as an urban geographer, what we can do, as well as all those wonderful things that we do within urban areas, it's the sheer weight of people as well, and the democratic weight of people. I think of a wonderful example 150 years ago in Leeds, where because the electorate had been widened, the elite who were trying to stop John Barron acquiring the great Roundhay Park for the people of Leeds, they didn't get their way in the end. The people won, and that is now a public land after, you know, in the fashion of a public park. And we hope that it will be used more for nature and for growing as well over the years as we evolve. So just a point about the importance of, yes, we may be very small in terms of the territory we have, but big in terms of combined voice.
Thanks very much. And from here in the front. Yep.
Yeah. Hello.
That's right. Just keep talking.
Okay.
Just hold it and keep talking.
Right. Okay. My name is Brian. I'm a City Councillor in Sheffield Green Party, and I've been on the planning committee for the last 2 years. Yes, and I've just stepped off it. What I'm finding throughout this time is that, yes, we've got lots of national regulations that stop us from doing anything. Rewilding, food production, that saving of animals and birds is not part of our system. What I think we need is also need to be standing out against the culture that's also within the planning department, from the officials, but also from the other councillors, you know, who I have been working with for the last 2 years, who are deaf to these things. And people need to have a mass participation in the planning system. You need to be turning up to planning meetings and challenging what is not being agreed and understood within planning officers' time and within the other councillors. So I would ask for mass participation, and that way we can get towards, you know, those things. It's what I call a trespass of the system, but not just on the land.
And that's making politics what you do. Okay, I think I can see lots of hands. What I'm going to do is just, if my panel doesn't mind, just take lots of contributions and then come back at the end to give everyone one come back at the end. So yeah, next one there. Yep.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about these large land estates where people don't have much control over what happens on them. We've talked about access to these, like a right to roam over large estates. We've talked about improving practices, but is it really enough just to talk about improving what happens on those? Or do we need to be talking more about changing the land system that these large estates are built on and bringing more into community ownership? And if so, how do we get there?
Oh, there's a nice big question. Okay, I can see one over there. Yep, you go that way.
A very short question. Just around I was horrified at hearing about the national parks in the UK having to have their own bottom of the barrel classification. What would it take to bring them up to international standards?
Oh, now there's a nice big question, which I think will come Steve's way. Right. Okay, yes, here. Sorry. Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond to Colin, isn't it? Yeah. Talking about the importance of responsibility in people who have who are roaming, and I think I'm probably on Bob Burzin's side. That I mean, I've been in trouble with the law in the past for destroying animal traps on the Peak District, and I'm just aware that there are these fenced-off areas where they have lots of stakes in the ground, which are away from public view. And when the public have gone home in the evening, they'll put in the animal traps attached to those stakes, and they'll remove them in the morning before the public come out again. And it's only the public, the police don't see this. They don't police it at all. It's only the public that can police that. So I just think it's incredibly important to be aware of that. And I do think it's naughty people like me that can control the gamekeepers.
And I think, yes, okay, I think I agree with that. And of course, those naughty people, quote unquote, can of course have mobile phones that collect video evidence. And I think we've seen some really horrifying video evidence, what's happening up on the moors. Okay, we're just about out of time. Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to come in? And I'm just looking at the remote audience to see if anyone wants to yell at me to say there's was that one more? Yep. No, okay. Right, I'm not getting any information about remote audience questions. I'm just checking because I don't want to make sure everyone has the opportunity of hearing any questions. No, right. All right. So what I'm going to do is 2 minutes each to respond to any of those questions or comments or say anything you'd like to. We'll just go in the video sitting there because that's nice and easy. Get Fran.
Okay, to compost. Yes, you're right. There isn't a food waste collection service in the city at the moment. There was a trial recently that was relatively successful, relatively good uptake. The problem is that the statutory responsibility that's coming in for curbside collection in 2020, so later this year, of course, there's no extra money to go with it. So it's one of those where it's been magicked out of nothing again. And that's often the case, you know, it's bottom of the pile. So that's not an excuse, but one of the opportunities that comes from that is that lots of local people could be actually producing compost. I am actively in talks with the council about this at a particular site. So we're doing our best to try and address it as a citywide issue, but then there's a big PFI contract in the way with Veolia. So that makes things really tricky. Can't remember when it expires. It's a long time. And in terms of accessing the big estates, I think it's revolution in occupation, isn't it? And squatting, I think that's how it works, isn't it?
Thanks very much. Cheers. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point to follow on from. If you look at the structure of land ownership in Scotland and also in England, I'm not sure about Wales. I'm not actually familiar with Wales. It's very top heavy in that a very small number of people own the bulk of the land. I think in Scotland it's something like 400 people own 50% of the private land in Scotland, and that's a huge area of land for such a small number of people. And you know, a lot of that's sporting estates, particularly in Scotland. You know, so for deer stalking, for grouse shooting, for salmon fishing, etc. And the land is managed for that, and it's you may make arguments for and against in terms of the ecosystems that result, but they are largely simplified. What, you know, I guess follow on from this is I always talk about the land power nexus. You know, it's a land wealth power nexus rather. You know, you've got lots of land, you've got lots of wealth, you've got lots of power in the House of Lords amongst other places. Not yourself, obviously, perhaps. I don't know. We can't do it. You know, you know, it's a three-legged stool. If you take one of those points away, the others will collapse. So in terms of giving us, the people access to the land, we've got to address that. But at the same time, I'll finish on what I said at the end of my talk, is that it's not just for us. We've got to do that for wild nature. And a lot of people talk about biodiversity, and I just think, okay, it rolls off the tongue nicely, but biodiversity doesn't necessarily mean wild and natural. So we do need to be a bit more nuanced about how we talk about that.
Very, very briefly, just add to some.
All right, very briefly.
Part of what happened with the land reform in Scotland came from abandoned estates where villages and small towns literally had to take over management of the land. And I could see some of that would be useful in the peaks and other national parks as the beginnings of best practice for some of the land issues that we're going to see in the future and that we're working towards.
That's definitely my thought. And I've got a question coming from online, and this is conveniently, I think, directed at Nadia, so that works quite nicely. A question from Margie Bryant online. Could the panel offer their ideas of how best to develop the sense of connection and belonging with the land and nature that Nadia talked about? Conservation organisations generally want to do this, but don't necessarily go about it the right way. A little bit of controversy to throw in there.
But yeah. Oh, there's so much. I think I'll get to that, and following on from your point, I guess we're talking about our rightful access to belong on the land, our rightful access to grow food and have access to food. These are the things that you say will start breaking down this kind of belief that we currently have, which is like we're just kind of accepting what we've got. Land is owned, it's already sliced up and parceled up. The day you're born, you're in debt because you have to find somewhere to live and you have to buy food because there's no land available to do the things. We're starting to talk about actually these are our rights again. And so maybe Occupy, Revolution, something a little bit harder, but these are the seeds of it, I think. So do some of those things. We can do that. We'll have a chat afterwards about that. In terms of connection, again, and I think it goes back to the national park question, what do we do about national parks? I struggle with this idea that there has to be this place for this place for this, like national parks have to be these fully wilded landscapes. There's never been fully wilded landscapes. Humans have been part of the natural ecology of our landscapes. So I think we need to recommon our lands to have people in and amongst them, living, working. I don't see why I can't sit and like play a little bit of drum and bass, have a picnic next to a nightingale because I've done it and they're fine. I don't see why there has to be these separate spaces. I understand that we're in a state of emergency, so we're like, panic, let's protect. But at some point, we're going to have to recommon our lands and to have people growing food next to like a field with curlew in it and living and working. And I think we're integrating it again. So I think and that's when our connection to nature will become passive, because not everybody is going to be a bird watcher or obsessed with lichen, but we are always passively absorbing those signals. We are walking through the streets and listening to swifts. We're recognizing the first hawthorn berries. We're always taking in these little things, even though we're not active naturalists. And so there needs to be more nature in cities. It needs to just be everywhere. And we need to just naturally, because of the way the system's built, it has to be around us. And, you know, if you don't like moths flying in your window at night, you'll get used to it. Yeah.
Bob. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the Environment Act, it does place a statutory requirement on local authorities to collect and compost food waste. So that should be happening in Sheffield soon. In terms of the other stuff about, you know, lady at the back with the question about Roundy Park, comment about Roundy Park and people power. I think that ties in for me with the comments about the planning committee and so on. I mean, I think there's a big thing about education. You know, if we all and this phrase, I don't think it's been used tonight, but it's sort of like, you know, about baselines, what we accept as a you know, as the current baseline. We just think it's normal what we have around us, but certainly I think we've all this evening tried to say that what we have is not all right and it does need to change, and it needs to change drastically. You know, if you're buying at all to that idea of a climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, then things really do need to change. And certainly the planning system, it's just perpetuating more of the same, and it's originated from people who want to kind of keep hold of their vision, you know, their bit of land, their wealth, their vision, their property. And I think we just need to challenge that. And, you know, things really do need to change drastically. We can't just rely on a few people from Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion making a noise about it. We all need to make a noise about it in a way, you know, that will get the government, local government and central government, get them listening.
Okay, one final short contribution from the audience.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure listening to you all. And, just of Southwest Sheffield, and that campaign is active. We've got around 500 people on the petition. If any of you haven't already signed the petition, please do. It's called Preserve Barracles for Nature and Community. Speakers together. It's about creating housing, access to nature, and just access to land. So thank you for that plug, Natalie.
Okay, I'll leave that one in. Okay, and we're not running too much over time, which is quite miraculous, I think, given the amount that we've managed to fit in. So thank you very much to the speakers for that. I'm just going to, from the chair, offer two final thoughts. And one is bouncing off what you said, Nadia, about people being part of nature and involved in nature. And if we look at the global scale, particularly at the global south, the richest areas of biodiversity are those where they've been protected by Indigenous communities. That is what's happened. And of course, one of the terrible things that happened in the early days of things like RED and RED Plus was that the idea was we're going to lock up the financiers will lock up this forest and protect it, and we'll throw all of the local people out. And that was a huge human rights abuse, and it was very bad for nature. And, you know, I think this is picking up off what Steve said. We are human animals. We've been talking tonight a lot about non-human animals, but we're all animals. We're part of that system. That's where we come from. And the other thing that I wanted to say, and this is a positive message, because I always believe we need to finish on a positive message. And it applies to what we're talking about tonight, but it applies to many other things as well. Where we are now, politically, economically, environmentally, educationally, is profoundly unstable. The one thing that is absolutely certain is things are not going to stay the same as they are now. They can't. They are profoundly unstable. And that's really good news, because where we are now is absolutely dreadful. We've seen that tonight. Pictures Bob was showing us of what's being done to the peatlands, on our uplands. So many things are absolutely dreadful, and we have the opportunity now. And the fact is that sometimes people say, well, you know, how do you know it's all going to work out? You know, we end up, or, you know, Sheffield grows all of its own vegetables and fruit. All of those sort of rather dull green bits of green grass all turn into orchards and community gardens. And I don't know that's how it's going to turn out. But what I know is that history is not pre-written. It's made by people doing things, people coming along to meetings like this, speaking at meetings like this, running campaigns. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you to everyone in the room. Thank you to everyone at home who hasn't been able to join us physically, but have joined us anyway. Those of you who are here, there's some drinks outside. Let's talk about what we can do. Come out of this event feeling like, yes, I've got an idea of something I can do. And we can thank all of our speakers for helping us do that, and everyone in the audience. Thank you very much, everybody. And I should finally say thank you for Festival of Debate for helping to make this happen and making it happen. Thank you.